sick today. He will be back next week. But we're going to broadcast a piece that was recorded at the University of Minnesota bookstore with longtime political science professor August Nimtz, talking about a book he's translated with his co-editor Gary Prevost, who teaches at St. Cloud. And the book is called Race and Cuba. And August Nimtz set up this talk by saying that there had been a New York Times op-ed which accused Cuba of ignoring a history of racism on the island and not addressing it. And this book, Race in Cuba, challenges that allegation as a lie, as does August Nimtz, Professor August Nimtz, in this talk. So, coming from the University of Minnesota bookstore, Professor August Nimtz of the Political Science Department of the University of Minnesota, talking about race and Cuba.
Events over the last decade in Cuba give lie to the allegation that the Cuban government hasn't allowed racial prejudice to be debated or confronted politically or culturally. There was an event in 2011 at the Havana International Book Fair. The Book Fair in Havana is the most important cultural event, the premier cultural event in Cuba. And at the book fair was a launching of the Spanish version of Esteban's book. And it consisted of the book fair sponsored by the Ministry of Culture. This launching of the book was greeted with all kinds of attention. There was a standing room only audience that came, very prominent figures, including the daughter of Raul Castro was at the event, the poet Nancy Morojon, all leading major figures, and there was a panel discussion which featured Esteban Morales and two Cuban academics and myself. I was on the panel because I wrote the foreword to the Spanish edition of the book. And the panel was chaired by Zubano. He chaired the panel and made extended remarks. The panel, its very existence, the attention it got, Radio Havana, Cuba did a report on the panel. The book was sold out. Immediately people rushed to get copies of the book, just like an earlier book that Esteban had written. The book was published by one of the leading publishers, a government-linked publisher in Cuba. The fact is that there's been a debate and a discussion in Cuba for at least since 1998, and Esteban Morales has been a part of that discussion. And it was largely Fidel Castro who initiated the discussion. And why 1998? Well, in 1998, Cuba was still experiencing the worst economic crisis in its history, sometimes known as the special period. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Cuban economy went into a tailspin. The gross national product was reduced by about a third. Exports dropped more than 50%. It was a very, very difficult period. The daily caloric intake for the average Cuban went from about 3,000 calories to about 2,000 calories a day. Everybody we knew who had friends, everybody lost weight in Cuba during that period. So it was a very, very difficult period. And what happened in that period is we began to see divisions that had largely been eliminated, racial divisions in Cuba, began to reappear during the economic crisis. And the reason for it, there are a number of reasons, but one of the major reasons was remittances, the ability of Cubans to have access to remittances from families abroad. In 1993, the Clinton administration lifted the amount of money that Cubans abroad could send to their relatives in Cuba from about $150 to, I think, around about $1,000. I have to go back and check the figures, around about $1,000. I've never been able to prove this, but I've always thought that the Clinton administration consciously did that in order to divide the Cuban population, knowing that most Cubans, those who had relatives abroad, were much more likely to be white Cubans. And the reason for that is because of the history of the revolution. Black Cubans have, from the beginning, embraced the revolution, see the revolution as theirs, along with the peasantry and the working class, and have advanced and defended it. By the 1980s, the late 1980s, the kinds of racial divides, inequalities that existed in Cuba before 1959 had not completely, but had largely been eliminated, especially around the questions of education and health care. And with health care, you saw this in the kinds of infant mortality rates, the improvements. Infant mortality rates and that's still the case in Cuba, for blacks in Cuba are better than they are for African Americans. You look at the life expectancy rates, better in Cuba than they are for African Americans. And that was the legacy of the revolution. But so around about 1988 and so, you began to see real progress was being made. But that began to be undermined. It began to be undermined in many ways because of who had access to the dollar and who didn't have access to the dollar. And if you had a relative abroad, you were likely to have access to the dollar. And white Cubans had disproportionate amount of access to the dollar because it was the largest number of people who ever left Cuba, the revolution, were almost exclusively, certainly before 1980, almost exclusively white Cubans. So, in other words, the kinds of economic differences along racial lines that exist within the United States began to be reflected inside Cuba because of the remittances. Now, there was an important difference, extremely important difference between Cuba and the United States in that having or not having access to a dollar was not life-threatening in the way it is within the United States and any other advanced capitalist country in Latin America and elsewhere. That is, if you didn't have the dollar in Cuba, you didn't have to worry about being thrown out into the streets. You didn't have to worry about not having access to health care. You didn't have to worry about education. So the most life-sustaining needs could be met. But having access to the dollar, though, it brought all kinds of perks with it, all of the extras in life. All of the extras in life. Access to things that tourists could only get in Cuba if you had access to the dollar. And that began to be reflected racially within Cuba. And it was in that context in 1998 that Fidel Castro raised that we have a problem and that this divide has to be addressed. And some of us who had a chance to see him when he came to the United States in September of 2000, he spoke at Riverside Church to a largely black and Latino audience. And it was a standing room audience, and that was my first time actually to hear Castro in person. And it went long. It was a long 4-hour presentation. But about midway during the presentation, he told this largely Latino and African-American audience that in Cuba, we have not been able to solve the problem of racial equality. We thought that we could simply pass laws at the beginning of the revolution, take steps to do that. And he said, we made important gains and so on, but we didn't fully appreciate that not everybody in 1959 in Cuba began in the same place. Because of the history of slavery and colonial rule and so on, in hindsight, he was admitting, we should have taken more special measures. We should have taken more special measures to overcome that pass. And so Esteban Morales, who was a professor of political science, political economy at the University of Havana, a black member of the Communist Party, along with other academics and so on, were a part of those initial discussions. And the comments that Castro made in New York City at Riverside in 2000 reflected the discussions that were already taking place within Cuba. And so Morales began to write on the topic. He was one of the first people to write extensive articles, and as a result, he was able to put together a book based upon the research and what he was doing in 2007. And it was called the Desafios, Challenges of the Racial Question within Cuba. That sold out immediately. It was published by one of the prestigious editorial houses, Editoriales Sociales, Ciencias Sociales, which is a government-run publishing house within Cuba. That was sold out immediately. He began to follow up on that, and the follow-up book is what was launched in 2011, and what we've done here is to translate most of that book and include in this articles he wrote after the publication of the 2011 book. So this is the most complete collection of his writings on the race question in any language, in book form. He has a blog site, and you can go. We mentioned it. It's listed here in the book, and you can go to it. If you read Spanish, you can go to it and read his publication. He writes not just on the race question, but also on U.S. foreign policy issues of corruption in Cuba. He's highly respected, and you can see his reply to this article. We posted it on the Minnesota Cuba Committee website. His response, not only his response, but the response of other Cubans, black and white Cubans, to this article. So that's the most up-to-date, in many ways. The reaction to this is perhaps the most up-to-date discussion in print on the race question in Cuba. So I think I'll let this suffice by way of introduction and take questions from people here about the book, the process of getting it into print and so on, and any questions that people may have.
You could have gotten a book published sooner, couldn't you? I remember reading that in a special period. They just didn't have money to publish books. So his articles, though, came out, even though he couldn't get a book out, simply because of the economic situation. Yes, he wrote his first article was in 2002, I think. And so, yes, there were publications there. One of the things he wanted to do with the book, though, is to get those articles to the larger audience, because they tended to be more in sort of intellectual, academic kinds of settings. And so the purpose of the book was to take it out of that milieu into the larger Cuban milieu. So yes, but no, you're right. The paper crisis. Anybody who visited Cuba during that period remembers how difficult it was to have. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
So, is it possible that what Zurbano actually said was edited by the New York Times, or do you feel like they put pretty much?
Well, notice I honed in on what was supposedly he said. The title, obviously, when it comes to, they put the titles. That's their title, and so the Times has never been a friend of the Cuban Revolution. at least since January 2nd, 1959. I say that because if you go back to the editorial page of the New York Times, January 2nd, 1959, you see this very glowing congratulations to the Cuban people for overthrowing the Batista regime. The love affair didn't last very long. Didn't last very long. It was as if they've been trying to make up for that editorial ever since. But, so yes, I'm sure there was editing, maybe the way it was translated and so on. But to me, this statement, quoting him, racism in Cuba has been concealed and reinforced in part because it isn't talked about. The government hasn't allowed racial prejudice to be debated or confronted politically or culturally, often pretending instead as though it didn't exist. And so, yes, that suggests to me that these are his words. That's.
But yeah. Yeah, I agree with you, and I liked your letter a lot.
Yeah, it was
not surprising. But Fidel acknowledges, and certainly there was a whole period of time in which there was a tendency on the part of people that you talk to say we're all just Cubans. You know, and not to acknowledge, and Esteban Morales said as much in some of the essays that he wrote, that there was a reluctance to discuss this because somehow it would be seen as questioning the unity of the Cuban people or their revolution, you know, and so there was this reluctance to, I mean, the legacy of, you know, of racism in Cuba and of slavery. I mean, you know, these are not things that get resolved overnight, but there was this reluctance. And on a legal basis, yes, they passed these laws, but the whole question of racial prejudice and how that manifested itself in a number of ways outside of education and health, in the question of employment, the types of jobs, you know, who was in the leadership of the Cuban Communist Party for years and who wasn't, you know, all those questions. And those were questions that I think Fidel Castro did take the initiative and lead on. And he even, I forget when it was earlier than 1998 when he talked about the need in Cuba, when he talked about the need for affirmative action in the leadership bodies of the party, you know, to advance not only Cubans who were black, but also women and working class workers in Cuba to advance them into the leadership. So, but there was that. I mean, so what this guy is referring to is not altogether false historically. Right. There was this reluctance to talk about. I'm not trying to defend him, but yeah. And so what do you think? So what opened up? What opened up? Do you think that changed that so that it is something that can be discussed now? Yeah. You know, more openly. Do you think? Right.
Well, one of the things he refers to, he says, before 1990, black Cubans suffered a paralysis of economic mobility, while paradoxically, the government decreed the end of racism in speeches and publications. And Esteban Morales, in his reply to this, also alludes to that in his book. And then what he's referring to is 1962, and Morales refers a lot to what he calls the silences after 1962. Okay. In 1959, when the revolution triumphed, Castro gave a very famous speech sometimes called the Four Battles speech, in March of 1959. The first time any Cuban head of state had actually explicitly talked about the history of racism in Cuba and the problems, unemployment, racial segregation, housing as racially, healthcare, and so on. So it was a speech that, for the first time, the July 26 movement, the movement that Castro led, actually explicitly talked about what needs to be done on a race question. So from 1959, March 1959, you could say, there's a big discussion. There's a fervent discussion going on in Cuba. It comes to an end in 1962, Morales says. And this is what he's referring to, Zurbano's also. And what he's referring to is there's a sentence in the Second Declaration of Havana that says that we've solved the racial question. That is, racism and racial discrimination have been eliminated. You'd have to go back, I don't want to misquote, but to go back and look at the actual sentence in the Second Declaration of Havana. And Morales, and he and I have a difference of opinion on this, what happened afterwards. Morales says that the silence, you couldn't talk about it anymore. Since it had been eliminated, you couldn't have that discussion. You couldn't have that discussion anymore. I agree with Esteban when he says that to declare that it had come to an end, Esteban says that's being voluntaristic. That is, you're willing something. But to argue, as Esteban tends to suggest, that it was this phrase in the Second Declaration of Havana that brought the discussion to an end, that to me doesn't sound like an explanation. It's not a materialist explanation, certainly. It's an idealist explanation. I don't think a phrase, a sentence in a document explains what he's talking about. I think there were a number of reasons for the silence, and the one that you mentioned is important. That is 1962, the missile crisis, the October missile crisis. There was this deep sense within Cuba that we had to unite, and anything that suggested that we were divided as a people had to be put aside. The priority was unity in the face of U.S. aggression, the importance of unity. You get a little bit of a flavor for it in all places. There's a critic of the Cuban Revolution on the race question. His name is Carlos Moore. But his autobiography, in his autobiography, there's a chapter on the missile crisis. What was it like to be in Cuba during the missile crisis? And this is someone who didn't like the revolution because he didn't think they did enough on the race question. But during that missile crisis, you read his autobiography, he subordinates that issue to defending the revolution, participating in all of the mobilizations that take place because of unity. So I think that fact. I think yes, the question of unity. We don't want to air our dirty laundry publicly. We don't want to give Washington any kinds of angles to be able to divide us and to undermine the revolution. By the late 1990s, I think your question, why was it possible to open up this question? In some ways, even though it was a very difficult period for Cuba, in some ways, the revolution was stronger than it had been. And there's a speech that Castro gave in 2005, and he says that we really don't have to worry about the United States overthrowing us. We will overthrow ourselves. And he was addressing the question of corruption, and that it had to be taken on. So I sense that, yeah, there was a sense of confidence. We could take this on now. We can take on this question that we've ducked, avoided in the name of unity. We're stronger. We're stronger now from a position of strength. That's what I think. That's my explanation of why it was. There were other things too. There was some sign. It was the closest that Cuba has ever come to it was a mini uprising in 1994 in a poor neighborhood. This 1994 was, at the moment, you may remember the people getting in the balseros, the rafters, people who were getting in the rafts, risking their lives and so on to come to the United States. That was the depths of the economic crisis. And in one of the poor neighborhoods, disproportionately black and mestizo, there was a little kind of a riot, mini riot. But the masses in the neighborhood came out and put it down immediately. The masses came out and put it down. And Castro went there. His bodyguards didn't want him to go, but he said, no, I insist that I go and see what's going on, and spoke to the crowd, because that had never happened before. Never happened before in the whole history of the revolution. But it was a signal, though. It was seen, though, because it was in a disproportionately, the people who participated in this little mini riot were disproportionately black and mestizo. I think it was one of the wake-up calls. It was one of the wake-up calls about dealing with this question of the economic crisis. So, yeah, that's the reason I think it was. And that was one of the arguments that Morales makes in the book. He says, look, we are stronger now. We can take on this question. We've put it aside, but the revolution is actually stronger, and it's important to advance the revolution, in order to advance the revolution, to really defend the revolution, this is a question that we have to think about. Yeah.
You talk a little bit, as you did at Mayday Bookstore, about the differences and the differences and similarities between how racism manifests in Cuba and the color issue versus what goes on here.
Yeah, that's an important issue, because it's always, to think about Cuba and to think about the United States, it's useful to think comparatively. And recognize Cuba's reality, and recognize that in many ways the reality in the United States is different from almost all of Latin America. In fact, the United States is the outlier when it comes to the race question, and for particular reasons. Related to the history of slavery, the abolition of slavery, the one-drop rule, which is unique to the United States, the one-drop rule, namely, if you have any African heritage anywhere so many generations back, 8 whatever generations back, that makes you black. It's the one-drop rule. The United States is unique in that regard. And in the United States, we operate with this biological definition of race, and that's not the case in Cuba and elsewhere. Skin color, that's one of the arguments he's raising in the book, that has to be addressed, the question of skin color discrimination. It's a part of the reality. So the United States had this one-drop rule, along with it to the system of Jim Crow, racial segregation. That was unique in the Americas. The only parallel is really in South Africa. But in Cuba, and the rest of Latin America, this kind of rigid racial segregation was not in place. And along with that is the race and the class question. That is, the working class in Cuba and elsewhere was much more integrated. They lived in the same neighborhoods, went to the same schools, and so on. Whereas in the United States, in the southern United States, in the world I grew up in, that simply was not the case. And so in 1959, the Cubans could do what we couldn't do here. That is, the fight here in the United States in 1959 was to overcome the racial divisions within the working class because of the Jim Crow system. That was what was on the agenda, the fight to overcome the racial divisions within the working class. And until those divisions are overcome, we can't do what the Cubans did in order to carry out a socialist revolution. As long as the working class is divided on skin color or other divisions, tribe, nationality, gender discrimination, and so on, all of that undermines working class unity. And so in Cuba, the working class was much more integrated. And you can see this in the trade union movement in Cuba. The union organized, all of the heads of the trade unions were black and mestizo In the United States, the trade unions were segregated, at least in the world I grew up in the southern United States. They were segregated. You couldn't talk about working class unity with segregated unions. So the fight to overcome the Jim Crow system. So the Cubans had a reality, a very different reality than was the case here. So the fight to overcome Jim Crow, to overcome the system of racial segregation, led to the civil rights movement. And the fact is that the Cubans did not have a civil rights movement before 1959. The closest they came to, and it was blotted out of the memory, was in 1912, and it really wasn't a civil rights movement. There was in 1912, there was a war mainly involving, it was sometimes described as a racial war, but in many ways it was a class war. Led to the deaths of thousands of blacks and mestizos and so on. But in many ways it would be an error to describe it as a race war. Whatever the case, the Cuban Revolution begins without the experience of having under its belt a civil rights movement. The Cuban Revolution is trying to solve all this baggage from the past. The revolution has to do, in other words, we're much more conscious around the race question because of the history of the civil rights movement, the black nationalist movements, and so on, in a way that is not the case within Cuba, not the case elsewhere in Latin America. And for one place where you really see this is very obvious, where there's the lack of the thing he's complaining about, and I took a stab at him at the end because he was an easy target at the end because he says that he's longing for the day where Cuba will have a black president, and but unfortunately we're not racially conscious in Cuba, and so that was an easy target. I said that I hope he knows that having a black president is no guarantee of racial equality, is no measure of racial equality. So yes, so the lack, yes, so the other places, yeah, you get to Dominican Republic and so on. I mean, the Dominican Republic, I mean, it's really quite interesting in the Dominican Republic on the question of race and race consciousness, or the lack of it, and so on. Or it does exist, color consciousness, and so on. The same thing in Mexico. I remember a few years ago there was an uproar around a stamp. Peking, I think was the name. It was a cartoon figure, popular in Mexican comics, and it was of a kind of a Sambo type figure, and it caused a roar because of when it was learned about here in the United States. It sort of was accepted within Mexico. There was not this uproar in Mexico about this character, and other people who know Mexico better than I do, people will make comments around indigenous issues and so on that simply would not be permitted within the United States because of the struggles that we had here in the United States. And so that the absence of those struggles around racial consciousness, understanding and what needs to be done and so on, all those are the kinds of things that the Cuban Revolution had to deal with and struggle with in the middle of trying to survive. You know, I can't ever forget the hostility of this country to the north, 90 miles to the north of Cuba, what the Cubans have to deal with on a daily basis. A hostile empire that encourages articles like this with these kinds of headlines. The Wall Street Journal had a piece a couple of days later after this, actually, in which it, on its editorial page about a black dissident. The first time I've ever seen the Wall Street Journal show a black person in Cuba. And it was supposedly someone who's a dissident and so on, who's being victimized and so on, and being embraced by the Wall Street Journal. So yes, we should always think about the United States as being the exception to the rule because of the particular set of historical circumstances that came about with the U.S. Yeah, the color question, we talked a little bit about that. I think I remember it made a bookstore, and the again, in the United States where you have these categories, black and white, which, if you think about it, really are not very descriptive. not very descriptive. And in Latin America and Cuba, Brazil especially, it's at least it's much more descriptive in terms of all of the gradations of color. You know, you've got a whole rich vocabulary to describe all of these gradations of color. So in the Cuban census, and one of the things again, in the Cuban census, and when you look at the Cuban census, the 2002 census and previous census in Cuba, you don't have a category called race. It's called según color de piel, according to the color of the skin. That's what the category is. It's not race. And keep in mind, all of that means we all know all of us are a little bit more sophisticated now. We know today that race is an invention. It hasn't always existed. There's no reason why it will always exist. The meanings keep changing over time. In the 19th century, when you're reading European literature, you see references to the English race, the German race, the Russian race, all of these different races and so on. It has a different meaning. The whole biological connotations of race come later in the century and so on, and that's what we carry with us, and that's being challenged. And as I oftentimes tell students in the classroom as we are discussing the question of race, everybody look at your neighbor next to you because that's your long-distance cousin. All of us, if the Human Genome Project is correct, we're all distant relatives. All of us are distant relatives. So it's a category that, so it has it served political purposes. I think the one drop rule exists, by the way, that's my little hypothesis, is that in 1808, when the U.S. Constitution was kicked in, that the clause in the Constitution that the slave trade would come to an end, the ending of the slave trade. You couldn't bring any to be more correct, you couldn't bring any new slaves in from Africa. The internal slave trade existed, but officially you could not bring any new slaves in from Africa. And I think every slave owner then had to deal with the question of labor. If it's not going to be resupplied, you got to figure out how to make sure you have your labor, even if it's your own offspring, as in the case of Thomas Jefferson.
The cotton gin came in. The cotton gin came in that solved some of that.
Well, yeah, that's 1792, because that gives a new life on slavery and so on. But whereas in Latin America, Africans are being brought into Cuba as late as 1864, and that's the case in Brazil. So slave owners in Cuba and Latin America didn't have this labor shortage problem that the Jeffersons had, and I think that's why the one-drop rule exists. Some of you know I'm from New Orleans, and New Orleans was once under Spanish rule, and in fact, it was administered from Havana, and in fact, the city charter for New Orleans is actually in Havana, and so that system of color gradations and so on that existed within Cuba, we inherited existed in New Orleans. I can remember that phenomenon and all of the skin color question. Yeah. In New Orleans, it was never simply about race. Skin color had to be included in the mix. Yeah.
I read the one chapter that you have linked to your website, and he briefly mentioned in there the Chinese also. Can you maybe talk about that a little bit?
Yes. One of the things he wants to do is to make sure that the complexity of the race skin color issue within Cuba and the Chinese presence is very important in Cuban history, as it is also in other parts of Latin America. And it's a part of a process at the end of the official end of the slave trade in the 1830s, and elsewhere, especially in the British colonies and so on. There was a labor shortage problem, and the way to make up for that labor shortage problem was indentured servants. Same thing in South Africa with indentured servants brought in from India, and in the Fiji Islands and so on. And so the indentured Chinese are brought into Cuba. And it's fascinating in many regards because you see the differences between the United States and Cuba on the Chinese question. Because in Cuba, again, within the working class, within the plebeian classes and so on, you had a much more integrated reality. So blacks, mestizos, Chinese are all intermarrying, living with one another. In the United States, that's just not the case. That is, when you come to the United States, you're forced into these very rigid categories, which don't allow for the kind of mixing that took place in a place like Cuba. So yes, not only in Cuba, but in Peru, there are other places where you have I was just listening to something the other day about the Chinese presence in other parts of Latin America. And so for the two wars of independence, and that's something that is very important, understanding the difference between Cuba and the United States. And this also came up in a discussion we had at May Day. When I first started interacting with a lot of Cubans in the 1990s, meeting people like Esteban Morales, and oftentimes the question would be to me from him and white Cubans also, why do you all call yourselves African Americans, not just Americans? Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of Cubans couldn't figure that one out. And to me, it's an interesting question. I began thinking about that because it said a lot about Cuba. And in one of the realities of Cuba is that black Cubans have a sense of ownership of the nation because they fought in the two wars of independence, and not only fought, but they actually achieved leadership positions, key positions within the leadership. Cuba's the only place in the Americas where you can walk down a major boulevard and see statues of black generals. The only place in Latin America. When I first saw it, I was blown away. There was nothing in my U.S. experience that prepared me for that. And a part of that was to give you the sense, so black Cubans have this sense of, no, I'm a Cuban first. There's a sense of ownership of the nation which hasn't happened so far. Maybe with the Obama generation, there'll be a sense of ownership of the nation. I leave open that possibility. But in Cuba, there's this real sense of ownership. And so the term Afro-Cuban is not used to refer to a racial category. It's used to refer to culture. So when you hear the term Afro-Cuban, it's almost always referring to a cultural category rather than a racial category. And that for black Cubans, yeah, there's a sense of, no, I'm first and foremost Cuban. And there's a sense of, yeah, we own the nation. In the United States, remember, that didn't happen. And for a brief moment in the Independence War, it's true, in some instances you had integrated units. But by the time you get to maybe 1812, you begin to see the segregation coming in. And certainly when you get to the Civil War, you've got segregated units, and black units can't even have black officers and so on. And so it wouldn't be until, the Korean War or Vietnam, really, that you really would have integrated units. And we know that the military and war in the military is an important vehicle for forging national consciousness.
About 4 years ago or so, there was an earlier episode of this discussion in the U.S. You mentioned Carlos Moore, and he wrote a letter talking about Cuba as being racist, and got signed by 60 U.S. African-American academics. Some of the most prominent ones, Cornel West was one of the signers, and August and Esteban wrote responses to that, and so I think this discussion has been going on here for a while too, and efforts to use this issue to try to undercut support for the Cuban Revolution.
You're listening to a talk from the University of Minnesota bookstore with Professor August Nimtz a longtime political science professor at the university, co-editor, translator of a book called Race and Cuba, which he worked on with Professor Gary Prevost, who taught at St. John and St. Benedict.
Kind of the accusation is similar to the one that Zurbano actually makes. And so, yes, we decided to respond to that, and that's in the. We have the documents. If people are interested on the Minnesota-Cuba Committee website, we have all the documents from that debate and that discussion on that issue. So yes, at least in the U.S. Carlos Moore, the person you're referring to who initiated that letter, he's a black Cuban and lives in Brazil and Florida. He broke with the revolution around about 1962, 1963. And in 1972, 71, he wrote something accusing the revolution of being racist. And I happened to be living in Tanzania at the time and had the benefit of seeing the response of defenders of the Cuban Revolution like Walter Rodney. And that was good for my generation because at that time, like many of us, we tended to look at politics simply through the lens of race and skin color. And that's the problem with Moore. He really can't see the world other than through skin color and race. And that's understandable. I mean, when you read, he's got it's kind of tragic autobiography, and you read his family life in Cuba. I mean, the race question inside his family, maybe what Sandy was alluding to, the reality. Yeah, within families, you can have a lot of discrimination on the basis of skin color. That happens in Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, and so on. I saw it in New Orleans. I know it very well. So it's understandable why he has this.
Can you explain that a little more?
That,
within the family?
Yeah, within the family, you can, because around skin color issues. Yeah, those who are lighter than others. Oh yeah, it can be real issues on it. And I saw it when I grew up with it in New Orleans. So I'm, in a certain sense, I'm sort of sympathetic because he was the darkest one in the family. He was the darkest one, and he was victimized. And and then there's something I haven't mentioned, the issue of it's an important issue about the history of the Cuban Revolution. I don't want to get into, but it's a part of the story, and the only reason I'm hesitating because the Cubans themselves are still, in my opinion, are not very clear on this question about how the revolution brought together different political currents to make the revolution. And one of those currents was the Cuban Communist Party, the old Cuban Communist Party, more specifically the Popular Socialist Party. That was the party that looked to Moscow. That was the party that looked to Moscow. And that party had always had a record. It always had a record of opposition to black nationalism. I guess maybe I'm trying to think what's the best way to put it. That is, it had within that party, it's a very contradictory party because a lot of blacks joined that party, just like in South Africa with the South African Communist Party. And that was the case within Cuba. A lot of blacks joined the Popular Socialist Party because it took some important stances in favor of anti-discrimination stances in the 1940s. But it had always been very skeptical and opposed to any kind of independent mobilizing on the part of blacks and mestizos. And and I think it's one of the reasons. It was one of the reasons for the silence after 1962. And we sort of know that because it was members of that current who had roots in the Moscow-oriented party that were most opposed to people like Malcolm X. Yeah. Yeah, it really had a hard time dealing with Malcolm X. From them, Malcolm X was, it was the same line of the Communist Party in the United States around Malcolm X. And there were very close fraternal ties between the U.S. Communist Party and the Popular Socialist Moscow-oriented party within Cuba had a similar line. And so Carlos Moore ran into that. He ran when he moved back. He left Cuba when he was in 55, 57, lived in New York, and became active in the July 26 movement when he was in New York. Then he moved back to Cuba in 62, and he ran up against both the race question and what I would call the Stalinist question. But rather than look at it from a class perspective, he drew only race, skin color conclusions about what he ran up against. But I think it's a factor. I think it's an important factor.
I remember Carlos Moore saying that the Cubans were scared to death that Obama would win because then all these African Cubans would riot more or less in Cuba. To me, it showed. I mean, he didn't look at anything about Obama in the first place. He didn't read his voting record. He would have seen he voted for war every time, to fund the war in Iraq even every time. He didn't read anything about what Obama had done or had not done, but it's just that because of black, as you were kind of saying, because the black was going to be in there, it doesn't look at the class issue anymore, in which that's the real issue with Obama. It's not racism, I don't think. It's a class issue. Once you get that high, the racism kind of evaporates a little bit, but anyway, maybe you could talk more about that, how he said that
he wasn't alone. I can only assume he's echoing that sentiment that Carlos Moore, that you referred to, that Carlos Moore talks about. I'm trying to find the actual sentences in here somewhere. Okay. The end of the Castro's rule. Some people think that's the New York Times formulation. Yeah, the Castro's rule. The end of the Castro's rule will mean an end to an era in Cuban politics. It is unrealistic to hope for a black president given the insufficient racial consciousness on the island. And so, yeah, I think that he wasn't alone, and there were a lot of people I know in other parts of Latin America and Ecuador. I remember talking to some people from Ecuador, from Colombia, about this question. The illusions of having, part of it is forgetting the history. As one of the people who responded to this, the first black president in the Americas was in Mexico. It was in Guerrero State. Yeah, that was the first black president in the Americas. You could say Batista. Batista was not quote unquote white. Batista was, he was seen as a mulatto, African, indigenous features and so on. That's the way he was seen, and during that period in Cuba, there were illusions on the part of blacks in Cuba that he's one of us. Yeah, that was, so yes, this is the problem, the fundamental problem of simply looking at politics through the lens of race and skin color and not looking at the class question. But it's good, it's an important thing of having, Nate knows in South African politics, that's one of the issues. Well, the great thing of having people like Obama in office now is that it helps to clarify that it always was a class question. We couldn't see it as long as people of that skin color were prevented from becoming president of the United States. As long as he was prevented from becoming, in South Africa, we couldn't see the class question. But it was always there. It was on the plantation. The class question was on the plantation. It existed. And, but.
You were talking earlier about the communist parties in so many countries never embracing the blacks. Was it a question of, I'm just curious.
On that. Yeah, not embracing.
Well, I'm using the wrong word, but I mean,
right.
but they didn't think they could be positions of higher power? Was it a question of they don't want to share the power, they thought they were intellectually inferior, or they just had such lousy education, Shelley, they couldn't get to the level of they thought would be adequate to run countries, or what? What do you think the reason is?
Okay. Well, we got a whole lot more than the last time we tried to play that, and it is a talk that kind of runs over the allotted time, but definitely something that was worth hearing. Cuba is one of those taboo topics, and this is why you support community radio, because we aren't afraid to talk about topics that don't get on corporate-owned media. I'm Lydia Howell. I've been sitting in for Don Olson today, punching the buttons. Want to remind you, my show's on Friday mornings, 9 a.m., and tomorrow, Friday, January 10th, 9 a.m., I'll have Ken Pentel, a longtime environmental activist. He worked for Greenpeace for years. He was with the Green Party, ran for governor. Now he has a project called the Ecology Democracy Network, and that will be on Catalyst Friday, January 10th. Going to hear a couple of messages, then we'll get to the headlines of the KFAI News at the top of the hour, followed by the wonderful Dakota Dave Show, and sitting in the driver's seat is our friend Pop Wagner. So don't go away.
Listen to Hmong FM every Friday evening at 6:30 to hear the latest news, music, and commentary about the Hmong community. I'm Kathy Muchapao, and I'll be your co-host with Vameng Mua, bringing you arts, culture, and music by Hmong artists. News with Hmong Today headlines, interviews, and live music. Hmong FM, giving you a glimpse into the Hmong American experience every Friday evening at 6:30.
Programming on KFAI is sponsored by Mayday Cafe, a Powderhorn neighborhood coffee shop located at 3440 Bloomington Avenue in South Minneapolis, specializing in organic fair trade coffee, homemade soups, sandwiches, and baked goods. Mayday opens at 6:30 weekdays, 7 o'clock on Saturdays, and 7:30 on Sundays. More information is available at 612-729-5627.
And you're listening to KFAI, your community radio station of the Twin Cities and beyond. 90.3 FM Minneapolis, 106.7 FM in St. Paul, online at kfai.org. We do live stream, and all shows are archived for 2 weeks after broadcast. And now, your KFAI News headlines.
I'm Steve Collar with your news update. An official said today that South Korea is suspending exports of tear gas canisters to the Gulf island nation of Bahrain amid pressure from human rights groups. CNN reports an official with South Korea's state-run Defense Acquisition Program Administration, which oversees the country's military trade, said, quote, "We've decided to suspend the shipment of tear gas because of the unstable political situation in Bahrain, requests from human rights groups, and civilian deaths." The move by Seoul comes after months of campaigning by rights groups who say the Bahraini authorities' misuse of tear gas has led to dozens of deaths as the Shiite majority protests against the Sunni-led government. Bahraini authorities argued that tear gas is necessary to maintain order. In October, the U.S.-based Physicians for Human Rights reported that Bahrain's police weaponized tear gas had caused the deaths of at least 39 people since February 2011 in an ongoing crackdown on anti-government protests, a claim the government disputes. The Obama administration wants to keep the International Space Station open for another decade. CNN reports the decision extends U.S. support for the orbital research platform by 4 years. In a joint statement, White House Science Advisor John Holdren and NASA Administrator Charles Bolden said the station offers enormous scientific and societal benefits. NASA hopes to use the station